Hey guys, welcome to my channel. It's called Foreign Tune and I'm Derek. This video series is going to consist of several shorter videos in which I show some hopefully helpful tips and techniques for a very basic restoration of a 1975 Mercedes 450 SL. I will end up removing nearly every component on this car, but I am going to reuse every component that I can because I really hate throwing away original equipment. And this car is going to be kept on a very shallow budget. It will, however, culminate with fresh paint and reassembly. Now, I have to start by apologizing because nearly every picture and video in this first episode was filmed with no intention of ever putting it onto YouTube. It is piecemealed together, to say the least, from the day that I found this car to just last week, which covers nearly 4 years. You can guess most of that time I wasn't working on the car itself, so my time frame for this restoration is roughly a year and a half from now because my youngest son wishes to drive this to his prom in his senior year. So without further ado, let's get started. What you're looking at is a 1975 Mercedes 450 SL that I found in a barn outside of Charlottesville about 4 years ago. The owner's father had passed away and he was an avid collector of cars, had 40 or so in his collection, and when he passed away he gave everything to his son, obviously, and his son had no desire or affinity for any sort of automobile. So I found it on Craigslist, sitting in this exact position. In fact, this picture is before I even walked around the car. I was told by the owner that this car was last used in some parade in Louisa, Virginia, 10 to 12 years ago, and has sat in this spot for over 10 years. This is exactly how I found it again. Top was down, and some kind of moderate-sized mammal family was living in the passenger floor. When I walked around the car, it first looked like it was going to be a really decent candidate for restoration, but I saw some signs of rust. In front of the rear tires and behind the front tires, a spot or two behind some trim on the door panels, but that was really all that I saw. At this point, I was still kind of over the moon that I'd found this car, and it seemed to be completely whole and original. So we get the car back to my house, and I finally get the convertible top to come up and out of its hole for the first time in 10 or 12 years, and instantly know it needs a new top. Yeah, of course. And you know what? I expected it. I wasn't truly surprised at all. As I walked around the car trying to take it all in, seeing what I could without pulling any parts off yet, I was still rather impressed. I knew this was going to be harder than I initially anticipated, but I had hoped it wasn't going to take as long as it has so far. I'm still struck by how pretty the car can be, especially with the top down, but I was just happy that it actually had a top at all. Originally, the car did have a hard top that came with it, but that's been long since gone. I had to later find one from a friend of mine and ended up buying it from him and putting it on. So looking at the data plate, I ran the serial number of the car and the VIN through the Mercedes Center, and they sent me back a build sheet which had all the serial numbers for the engine and all the different options. This car originally came with a 117-982 engine, and in my engine bay I happen to have a 117-985. So someone had upgraded the engine to the Bosch K-Jet and a whole new block. Switching gears to the interior, well, this was in pretty bad shape as well. The seats actually ripped as you pressed on them with your hands. And like I said earlier, there was some kind of moderate-sized mammal living in the passenger footwell. So the smell was a little overwhelming, even though the top has been down on this car for the past decade. Looking around the interior, I noticed that the center console and all of its wood was in really bad condition. It looks good from far away, one of those 10-footers, but once you get close to it, all of the veneer was cracked. I had to take it over to a furniture shop here in town, and they ended up reconditioning all of it. And now that's been sitting on my shelf for about 2.5 years now. I really like the layout on the interior. Everything's easy to read. Dials are large. Everything's right, basically at your fingertips. But I see a lot of work in here too. Everything's going to have to come out, and everything's going to get reworked. So yeah, this is going to be a good time. So the odometer shows 81,000 miles, and who knows however many are on this engine and transmission combo, or even if this is my original transmission. This was probably 4 or 5 months after I got the car home, so I have it running at this point, but it's not running very good. Obviously there was something wrong with the main Bosch control unit. But I had to take the fuel tank out of it. I cleaned out all the rust, coated it with, I think it was an Eastwood product I used, and blew out all the fuel lines. I put new fuel injectors in it. I refreshed the entire fuel pump assembly under the rear end, and just general maintenance to get this thing running and moving on its own power. At this point, I think even the spark plug wires were wired wrong. Someone had the distributor cap wired for a 13572468 numbering sequence. So I had to fix that and make it the Mercedes way of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So again, I'm going to apologize for showing a lot of the same imagery over and over and over. I just keep thinking every time I record it, I'm going to find something that I hadn't seen before. I'm bound to catch something that I've missed. So please bear with me in that aspect. It'll help me get this thing back together quicker, and hopefully it helps you get yours back together quicker. And again, this video is just going to be for inspiration to get people out and start working on your own cars. These things are disappearing almost daily at this point. The rust has really gotten to them. The engines are letting go. Everybody knows the weak spot on these cars is the timing chain, or the whole system itself. So yeah, I just want to get this car back up on the road and give it back some of its former glory. So at this point, I was feeling pretty good. Got the car running, I got it moving. Everything was kind of going my way. I was already working on the interior, trying to take some of those pieces off, when I decided, you know what, let's slow down. Let me go look at the bumpers. Let me look behind some of the trim pieces, and man, was I disappointed. So, long story short, both fenders were beyond repair. In front of the tires and behind the tires on both fenders, behind the headlights on both fenders, completely rotted through. So I knew this was going to be a much longer project than I wanted. So I did what anyone in my position would do and completely ignored the rust. As you can see, I pulled the fenders off just to get rid of them. I didn't want to look at them anymore. But the car drove, it moved under its own power pretty easily at this point. It starts and drives around. So I decided to go and pull the engine. Yep. Engine had some leaks. Transmission definitely was leaking very badly. And I wanted to do the subframe bushings. So cleaning up the engine bay, subframe bushings, transmission leaking, the easiest solution was to pull the motor. So that's what we're getting to right now. This is 4 years into the ownership of the car, and this is how far I've gotten. Yeah, I'm kind of ashamed. See, I told you it ran. I just wanted to get it outside, warmed up one last time, do a quick walk around prior to going in the bay. The little trim pieces, panel pieces that fit behind the tires, yeah, they were rusted out. So I got new ones already. Interior still looks nearly exactly the same as the day I picked the car up. RPM gauge works. Fuel gauge does work now that I put a new fuel sending unit in it. And this does not have the optional back seat. But yeah, just one last look around the car before I pulled it inside. And yeah, it's going to be a fun project. Well, hell, it already has been. So I got the car in the bay at this point, and this is just before the hood came off. And once again, I'm going to apologize for, I don't know, what is this, the fifth time, on how this video is laid out. I know it's going to be crappy. I just hope that somebody can at least use it for familiarization on their car for right now. I promise the future videos on this car will be more vivid, more in-depth, with camera work the whole time. A lot of this car build was done with me stopping, doing the work, and then turning the video back on after the parts have been removed. I am going to get that fixed in the next couple of videos. This is new to me, so I'm trying to figure this out on my own. And hopefully it's at least somewhat entertaining, or at the bare minimum helpful for somebody. Again, just going over everything on this car with a camera to assist in reassembly. I'm still looking around trying to get familiar with things. I know that piece is going to have to get replaced because it leaks like hell. That was my heater valve. My cruise control cable, right where it connects to the throttle linkage, is broken, so I got to fix that as well. I'm just finding a bunch of little things that I'm going to have to replace and update as we go forward. I've already got the warm-up regulator done. The air valve was cleaned up and tested on my oven in some boiling water. Worked great after I fixed the slide. Here, I've already got the alternator out of the way so I can see more. I do have to take the power steering pump off. I did get the charcoal canister out, which I plan on making a video on later. I'm going to tear it apart, clean it, and put new charcoal back in it. The exhaust transducer valve, I don't even know if it's truly routed properly with all of its vacuum lines. But this is a large learning curve for me, and I'm really excited to get it started. When you're doing this on yours, just be careful of all the connectors. A lot of them are very brittle, so pay particular attention to get them apart as gently as you can. I'm still looking for potential places to hook up the engine hoist to as well. See, that one I labeled a long time ago to the straight black transducer. I had a broken nipple on one of the transducer valve inlets. So I did end up getting one of those from, I think, FCP Euro. But getting the power steering pump off, out of the way, getting the bracket for the power steering pump off and out of the way, allowed me to connect the hoist to one of the bolts behind that. Every time I take something off this thing, I hope I can remember where it goes. And every time I take something off this thing, I realize how much more work there's going to be. This is just something that I'm going to do as a hobby in the part-time. Obviously, I have a day job. It's amazing how much grease, grime, and filth is in this car. This engine must have been replaced early in the car's life, because it sure looks like it's got 40 or 50 years of grease and grime layered all over it. You can see the overspray was just terrible when they painted this car. They didn't really care. So here I decided to drain the cooling lines for the transmission, which came apart pretty easily. I can't really complain. I got the power steering pump out of the way as well. Charcoal canister's obviously gone. Then I got sidetracked with this stupid trim piece on the nose. But that wasn't very difficult. 3 screws held that on. Got that up and out of the way and wanted to get back to the radiator. Now the radiator does have two, I don't know what you would call them, little metal pieces. Here, right here on the left, that is one of the pieces that mounts to the left side of the radiator and one on the other side of the car. And once you pop those out of the way, you have to actually use a floor jack and press the radiator up and out of the car. But anyway, we'll get to that later. I had to take the cross brace from the front end off the car, and the electric fan came out. Just to get to the condenser, there was a lot of crap that was wedged in the electric fan. But really simple stuff. Just take the bolts out as you see them. It's pretty much that simple. I was honestly surprised on how much damage the fan actually did to the condenser's fins. So anyway, that'll be another project for another day, straightening all those things out. Here I'm looking at the routing of the green and the black wire. The green wire being the distributor to the computer wire, and the black wire is the crankshaft position sensor wire. Figuring out which harness each one of those belong to. As well as looking at the coil, seeing the orientation of it, negative, positive, towards the front or rear. In this case, it's the positive is towards the front of the car. And then the routing to the coil itself as well. Not much more I'm going to get out of this. Just looking ahead, taking all of this out of the fender well, out of the engine bay, so I can degrease and respray the engine bay before we put the engine back in, obviously. All that overspray, it's going to take hours to get off. I am not looking forward to that. As I alluded to earlier, getting this radiator up and out, it was a tight fit, and I had to use the floor jack on either side of the radiator with a block of wood to get each side to break loose. I actually lifted the front of the car probably 3 or 4 inches before it actually started to move. So I'm holding right now the other clip for this side of the radiator, just to make a mental note of where this one and the other one go back to. However, once I got the left and the right side to start moving, I centered it, and then I was able to lift the radiator out using probably a 1.5 foot long 2x4 on top of the jack. And once we did that, it really came out pretty effortlessly. Not a lot of bolts holding this in, actually. It's mostly just going to be the pressure fit with those rubber grommets into the slides on the side of the frame rails. Sorry about the angle. I am going to get better, I promise. So getting back to the rest of the car, a little overview, again, trying to reset my brain to figure out where I need to go next. Yeah, EGR valve is going to come off. I'll try to take the exhaust manifolds off. I got the AC connector off. So working on the wiring harness and then getting all of the spark plug wires out of the way. And then working my way back to the rear of the car, trying to get all the heater hoses released, the vacuum lines that are back there, the throttle linkage is still back there, and the fuel system. Here, getting to the fuel system, it did give me a little bit of a pain in the butt, but I eventually got that. Getting to the EGR, I was really surprised on how easy a lot of this stuff came apart. I let most of these larger fittings soak with some WD for a day or two, but they had no right to come apart this easy. I've worked on cars from upstate New York for years, and I would have something that's 3 years old and have to cut bolts off. So this car completely shocked me. So I got the throttle linkage out and ended up losing one of the marble-sized balls that goes onto the firewall. It went under the brake booster somewhere, and I'm hoping that I will find it at some point in the future. To date, I still haven't found it. But there wasn't too much more to disconnect back here. That was a vacuum line, which seemed like it was an afterthought, probably something to do with the retrofit of the 985 engine. But that's a vacuum line that goes into a fitting screwed directly into the head. Never seen that before. Getting to the other side, all those hoses slid off pretty easy. I was able to get the exhaust manifold off on the passenger side with little effort, but the hoses slid off with ease. Barely any pressure needed. Last little vacuum line going up there into the dash, and the wiring, just two connectors, which came apart easily. Slid them out of the way. Yeah, that's right. This was when I was about to lift the car to go up, and a thunderstorm came through. We lost all power, so everything got paused. I had to go get the generator started just to get life back into the house before I could get back into the garage. So I got the car up. I knew I had a bunch of draining to do. Antifreeze is still leaking on my head, and I needed to get the fluid out of the transmission. I did already put a new steering stabilizer on it probably 2 years ago, and then once I got it up on the lift, I could actually see there's more rust behind all of the wheels. But the bolts for the exhaust system, really easy. Every one of them just came apart. I was shocked. I wasn't sure how much of the exhaust system could be saved. I do have a new muffler or tailpipe piece. I haven't gotten a center section yet, but it looks like I'll have to find one. So getting the old Milwaukee out, it was time to start a hacking. As you can tell, I get sidetracked pretty easily. Anyway, yes, get back to it. Alright, muffler is out. My hangers, I think I'm done with that one, are out. And it's in really good condition back here, actually. Far better than I anticipated. I had already degreased and degunked the rear diff. It was covered in crap. Yeah, the parking brake I know is going to be a pain in the ass. I haven't even tried it. There's no point in trying. That's going to have to just be a new parking brake cable. At this point, I'm still trying to figure out how I'm going to get the transmission out of the car with the engine. My transmission stand doesn't work, but exhaust is off. Really simple to be this nice to me. So, thank you. Getting back to it, my next task was trying to get the right side exhaust manifold off, and again, I did. It was easy. The left side, the bolts were easy enough to loosen for the ones that I could reach. There's 2 or 3 bolts which are impossible to get to. So that ended up staying on the car when I pulled it. So I moved on to draining transmission. And here's a tip. Drain the torque converter as well so you don't have a huge mess on the floor. As I was saying before, here's your access. All you got to do is, manually crank the engine around until you see that 5mm, I think it was, Allen bolt. Pull that out and let it drain, and you'll get probably half a quart out of it, maybe a quart. Here I got the passenger side exhaust manifold off the car, and now I can see the motor mount on the right side for the first time. I was able to get to the left motor mount with the exhaust manifold still in place, but here, this is the assembly for the, I don't know what you call it, it's the shock for the engine. There's one on each side, but that's the mount. It connects to the motor mount. And then there's the heat shield for the starter, which also came off pretty easy. Not the starter, the heat shield. The starter stayed in the car. I couldn't get the bolts off the head of the solenoid, so I decided to take the wiring off the car instead. And this is me trying to remember where that was going to go. That was the main lead. And then the secondary wiring went to this distribution panel. Yeah, I have a feeling this imagery is going to be crucial in reassembly. As of this point, I'm not using a shop manual. I figure, why not increase the level of difficulty? So moving back to the drive shaft, paying attention here, the bolts that go through the prop shaft and connect to the rear diff do not have washers on the head. However, the bolts that go through the rubber bushing to the differential do have washers on the head. I think that was the whole point of me staring at this for so long. I'd already gotten the center support bearing off. Mark the position before you take that apart. And then the front drive shaft connection to the transmission was still simple. I left the bushing on in the transmission, just disconnected the drive shaft, just the 3 bolts on the front. But I did have to get it off the lift so I can get the transmission support freed up. I can't, again, with my broken transmission jack, everything has to be done here on the ground. So, yeah, this was a good time. The left side of the engine has the speedometer cable, the 4-pin connector to the transmission, and the right side of it had the vacuum line. I have to say, getting the engine out of the car required an extremely steep angle with the hoist. So you are definitely going to need an adjustable crank on your engine hoist. It was at least 45, probably 55 degrees, 60-degree angle to get it up. And then you had to crank it over to level it, to get it over the front of the car and get it out. But I did tug on it for a few minutes and realized I forgot the grounding strap, which is kind of there on the right side, staring at me now. But I'd had to have to go back under and get that off. It is bolted to the bell housing. Also, you're going to have to remove the steering control arm. Connects the right and left tire. There's no way you can get the transmission around or up and over that thing. So just remove it. But there it is, empty bay. Probably a few more weeks worth. Transmission was leaking really bad, which is one of the primary reasons I wanted to pull this out. And I'll take the intake off, clean everything else underneath it, put all new rubber on it, new seals, clean the thing up. I have a peek inside all the cylinders to see if they're going to be okay. When I put it back in, I will leave those 8-inch transmission cooler line hoses off the car. I'll put them in after they became a pain in the butt trying to get the engine out of the car. You need every inch you can get. Last little couple shots of the engine bay. As you can see, I put the steering stabilizer rod back in here so I can at least turn the tires. But here are the motor mounts in all their greasy glory. Fortunately, someone at some point had replaced these as well. The shocks feel like they're in really good condition. Stabilis is, I believe, the brand name, but came apart really easy. I do have to get the bushing kit. All of the bushings on the motor mount shocks are in really bad shape, so they'll get replaced, but the shocks themselves are in great condition. No complaints. Getting back to the motor, this is what I used for lifting points. Only 3 positions, one on the front of each head and one on the rear of the motor, driver's side. Separating the transmission was relatively simple, as you can imagine. Just make sure you support the transmission as well. I did choose to leave the transmission cooling lines connected to the engine and just separated them after it was out of the car. That's where the starter was, which again, I left that in the car as well when I took it out. And then over to the transmission. 2 linkages, a throttle cable, the speedometer cable, and the electrical connection on this side, and just a vacuum hose on this side. relatively straightforward, guys. Well, thanks for watching. This is part 1 of I don't know how many parts there are going to be. It's probably going to be a couple weeks before I can get the next video out. I may do some shorter videos, such as rebuilding the starter, rebuilding the charcoal canister, cleaning out the engine bay, etc. We'll see how much I can get done in the next week or two. So again, thanks for watching. Thanks for checking out Foreign Tune, and I promise it will get better from here.